Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be diving into something pretty intriguing, something called the Melchizedek teachings. We're taking this from paper 98 of the Urantia book, and we love getting into these less well-known areas of religious history.
Absolutely.
So it's a really, really old set of teachings. Like we're talking almost 4,000 years old.
Right.
And it's believed to have influenced a lot of the big Western religions, even if most people have never heard of Melchizedek.
Yeah, it's really a story about how this kind of simple idea, the belief in one God, how that idea can spread across different cultures and time and leave its mark on these huge, religions that we know today.
So who was this Melchizedek?
Mm.
And what made his teaching so different and revolutionary, especially for back then?
Well, the book tells us that we're talking almost 4,000 years ago. There was this guy, Melchizedek, and he lived near where Jerusalem is now, and he started teaching this idea of one God.
Okay, so that makes sense, right? Like that tracks new religious figure, new religious idea, new religion.
You'd think so, right?
Right. Yeah.
But it actually takes a really interesting turn there.
Okay.
Because Melchizedek, he wasn't really interested in establishing some kind of structured religion.
Oh, interesting.
With all the rituals and hierarchies, that we often associate with religion.
That is surprising. So why even teach about one God if you're not to create like a new religion out of it?
Right. It's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it?
Yeah.
But that's what I think makes this whole thing so fascinating. So according to the book, Melchizedek, he really believed in this idea of like a direct connection with the divine.
Okay.
Without needing, priests or intermediaries or anything like that.
Okay.
And this idea, scholars call it anti-priestcraft.
Mm.
And it had a huge impact on how his teachings were shared and how different cultures receive them.
Anti-priestcraft. So
Right.
so he was basically saying like no to having a powerful organized priesthood.
Yeah,
know?
exactly. And you have to remember, this was a really radical concept
Yeah.
for the ancient world. Like back then, religious authority was basically the same as political power. They were all intertwined.
It makes you wonder then, how did these teachings spread so well without that kind of formal structure in place to support them?
Well, I guess you could say that ideas, they're kind of like water, right? They tend to find a way to find their own level.
Okay, yeah.
So Melchizedek's teachings, they spread through a few different ways. Like there were dedicated missionaries who traveled around, but also just the natural movement of nomadic peoples and cultural exchange along trade routes, all that contributed.
So it's like a ripple effect starting from one point and just like expanding outward.
Exactly, yeah. And it reminds us that even way back then, ideas could transcend physical boundaries and geographical limitations. People were sharing ideas even in the ancient world.
Were there any other factors you think that helped these teachings gain traction aside from those ways of spreading around?
Oh, for sure. One of the biggest ones was how adaptable the teachings were. I mean, Melchizedek's main message, this idea of one God, it was so simple but also so profound
Yeah.
at the same time. So it was actually, relatively speaking, easy to integrate into different cultures' existing belief systems.
Right.
And that turned out to be super important as his teachings moved west and met all these different cultures in the ancient Mediterranean.
Speaking of the ancient Mediterranean, it makes me think about ancient Greece, right? Like they were known for their philosophers and all their different gods, but they didn't really have a strong centralized priesthood, did they?
Not really, no.
And I wonder if maybe Melchizedek's whole anti-priestcraft idea had something to do with that.
Yeah, you could be right. It's interesting, right? The Greeks, they definitely had temples and rituals and all that, but there wasn't this like dominant group of priests who were in charge of like official religious dogma.
Right.
And because of that, I think it created this environment where, people were free to think about and interpret their beliefs in their own way.
So even though they still believed in Zeus and those other gods, they weren't necessarily tied to like super strict rules and interpretations.
Exactly. And so as these Melchizedek teachings were spreading through Greece, they found all these people who were already having these really deep conversations about the divine,
Wow.
So you have this kind of like intellectual energy already there, and then you combine that with this like more relaxed approach to religious authority, and it created this perfect space for those seeds of like monotheism, this belief in one God, to really take root.
So it's not just like a simple swap,
Yeah.
right? Like old belief out, new belief in. It sounds like there's this real mixing of ideas happening.
Yeah, Yeah, it's much more organic than that.
Uh,
It's like this fusion, this blending of all these different threads. And it's right in the middle of all this that you get Greek philosophy really taking off.
right.
You've got thinkers like Socrates and Plato, really pushing the boundaries of conventional thinking.
It makes you wonder, like, how did all that philosophical thought, did it affect how they understood these Melchizedek teachings, do you think?
I think it must have, yeah. And the Urantia book, it points out how some of the Greek philosophical schools, they started to kind of echo this idea of a single universal force that's behind everything, that underpins the whole cosmos.
Okay.
They might not have called it God in exactly the same way that Melchizedek did,
Right.
but the basic idea was really similar, this idea of oneness. And it resonated with a lot of people who were searching for like a more unified understanding of the universe.
It's like all these ancient threads of thought kind of weaving together, creating something new.
Mm-hmm.
But then what happened when these ideas, this mix of Melchizedek and Greek philosophy, ran into the Roman Empire? They were more about structure, weren't they? Like
Yeah.
a more official approach to religion?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where things get even more interesting. So you've got the Roman Empire, and as they expanded, they encountered all these different cultures and beliefs, right? It was like
Yeah.
this giant melting pot. And so you had the official Roman gods, of course, but then also all these foreign cults and what they called mystery religions, kind of all swirling around together.
Mystery religions. Okay, now those sound interesting.
Yeah.
What were those all about?
So imagine a time when, the traditional religions, they weren't really doing it for people anymore.
Okay.
They weren't satisfying that deeper need, that yearning for something more. And that's where these mystery cults came in. They had these secret rituals. They promised salvation or, a better afterlife. And they offered this really personal connection with the divine.
So it sounds like a really wild mix, right? You've got the traditional Roman religion, you've got these Greek philosophical ideas floating around, and then these mystery cults promising all these intense experiences. It's hard to imagine how this idea of just one God spread by word of mouth could compete with all that.
Yeah, it really was a vibrant time for religion in the Roman Empire. And you're right, those mystery cults, they really tapped into something that the older, more official religions didn't always have, that focus on personal experience, that emotional connection.
Yeah, definitely. Were there any specific mystery cults that were especially popular back then?
Well, the Urantia book, it talks specifically about the influence of Mithraism. Have you heard of that one?
I've heard the name, but I don't know much about it.
Yeah, it was this Persian cult, and it had become really popular all over the Roman world. And get this, it actually shared some pretty interesting similarities with early Christianity. Like, they both had this idea of a savior god, and they both talked about an afterlife.
Wow. So it makes you wonder, did those shared ideas, those similarities, did they help Christianity as it was first starting to spread? Like, did it make it easier for people to accept some of those ideas?
That's a really good question. It's definitely possible. It's hard to say for sure what gave Christianity the edge, what
Yeah.
made it ultimately become so dominant. But it's clear that all of these different threads of religious thought, all of those ideas mixing and changing over centuries, it created this really fertile ground for Christianity to take root.
Right. It's like all those older traditions and ways of thinking, they laid the groundwork in a way. So as we kind of jump ahead to today, can we still see any traces of those ancient Melchizedek teachings in Christianity now?
That's what's so fascinating about all of this, right? Because even though Christianity went on to develop its own unique set of beliefs and practices, it's really interesting to think about how those early encounters with Melchizedek's ideas might have shaped things.
Right.
Like the idea of one God, for example. That was revolutionary back in Melchizedek's time, but it became absolutely central to Christian theology.
Yeah, it's like this long game of theological telephone where ideas get passed down and they change a little bit with each retelling.
Haha, I like that. And it reminds us that religions aren't static, They're always evolving, always being influenced by the world around them, by people's changing understanding of themselves and the universe.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive into this really unexpected story of the Melchizedek teachings, what would you say is like the biggest takeaway? What can all of this teach us about how belief systems change and grow?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that beliefs, they're like ideas. They don't usually just travel in a straight line, you know what I mean?
Hmm.
They twist and turn, they bump into other ideas, they blend together in ways that we might not expect. And even if we don't always recognize them, those ancient echo, those whispers from the past, they're still there, reminding us how interconnected human thought really is, how these ideas can transcend time and cultures and still resonate with us today.
It's amazing to think about, isn't it? It kind of makes you feel connected to all those people who came before us, all asking the same big questions.
It really does.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope you'll keep exploring these unexpected corners of history with us.